Hello, in this video, I'm going to introduce you to JavaScript Fetch API and how you can use it to communicate with APIs. By the end of this video, you should be comfortable using Fetch API. Let's get started. Welcome back. Fetch API is a simpler, modern way to make network requests that is a better alternative to the old XML HTTP request that has been used in the past and is still active. You can use it with other frameworks. But Fetch API makes it very easy for you to use JavaScript to make network requests to a server. Fetch API, there are different concepts that we're going to learn about Fetch API in this video. We'll begin with the first, which is the intro. The second will be a basic fetch function. Then we will look at handling the errors, then also handling different HTTP request methods. So get, then post, then put, then delete, how you'd handle that. Then since we are doing HTTP requests, we need to also look at handling headers, and also the fifth, dealing with the cross-origin errors. Then we also need to learn how to use async wait to fetch data using Fetch API. So these are simply like about 8 or so points. So this is the third, this is the fourth, this is the fifth, this is the sixth. In fact, there are only 7, and we are done with the first one. Fetch API is simply a way to fetch data from a server or to make network requests. That's an alternative to XML HTTP request. I'll begin with the first one by creating a simple step-by-step fetch API request. The first step is to, of course, define the source of data. In this step, I'll create a constant, then the URL, then I'll pass in the URL. I can get the URL from JSON placeholder. I'll open this and enlarge this, then pick this. I want to do a GET request, so I'll pick that and close that. So that will be the source of my data. So I like to enlarge this. Since we have the data source, now we need to move to the next step, which is to create the fetch function. This is the first step. The second step, fetch function. Fetch function simply works like this. So you do something like const. Now we have the data. Then we create a new constant here, fetch data, that we will use. Then we quit it to fetch, which is a method of the API. Then you now pass this URL. At this particular point, if we now logged fetch data, it's supposed to give us a promise. And you can see it's now a promise that is in a pending state. Now, since we have the promise that is in a pending state, now need to move to the third step, which is consume the data. To consume the data, we simply need to call this fetch data. Then, since we now have it as the promise, we use the then method. If you don't understand this syntax, I've done a video on promises, and it's a very good video for you to get started with promises, and as well as dealing with all these other await async. I have videos for that. We pass in here a response. We'll get a response from the server, and this response will of course be a function, and we now need to pass in here a check to find if our response from this request is okay. So we can do an if, then we check if this is not okay. If the response is not okay, response not okay, we just need to throw an error, and this error needs to be simply a simple error, to just say bad response. That's a guard clause to prevent us from running into errors that we don't know if we are able to reach the API. Right, we have already done that. Now we have the data. Presuming we have the data, now we need to pass it to convert it to JSON. So we simply need to return the response.json. Up to this point, we now have the data. Now we need to move to the next step of handling. This should be handling the errors. So we've looked at creating the basic fetch. Now we need to handle the errors. This should be response. There's a typo here, response. This should be response. Response. This should be response. We now need to introduce the catch here, since we now have, so that catch, then we are catching the errors, then we need to close that. Then this error, we need to just console.error. We log in the error, then we say, then we're going to simply pass in the error. So we've simply taken care of this step, handled the errors. Now we are in the next part of how do we handle different kind of methods like HTTP request methods like GET. But in the meantime, we can first of all log to see if we are going to make this work. We can wrap this into a function so that we can handle it easily. So we can do this get API data, then that function has all this. Then so we have this function and it's getting the data from this API, then handling the errors the right way. To display this data, we now need to add an extra then, because we here on this then method, we are simply consuming that data and returning a JSON. So we need to now consume that data and display it on the console. So we can do a then we pass in the data. This is a function. We create a function. Then in this then, we now consume the data by simply logging. So it's just simply log the data. This function is complete. We can simply call it to display the data on the console. So we copy that, and at the bottom here, once we call the function, we have the data pulled from the API asynchronously. That's the first step of creating and handling errors of a fetch API request. I want to move to the next part, which is different HTTP requests and handling these headers. I'll slightly explain, I'll get back to this, but I'll simply use this example to explain. If we had different methods like we needed, we would do it differently, like we would pass the method. Let me show you how that works. So let me just get rid of that. We can repurpose it in the future of this tutorial in the next section. So we can just start afresh. We just get the URL, some URL. Then we do a constant, which is the data. Suppose we do a post. Suppose we are working with a post method. What we will do data to send. Then this data can be just an object with a key and value. So a simple object. Then now in our fetch request, we can pass in the URL without creating another constant. Then once we pass in, we add data. We now add the data here. Then this needs to be separated with a comma. We now add the data here for the method. So we do method, that will be, we equate it to post. Then we can also as well add the headers. And now the headers, we pass in an array. This can take content to be a string type. Then this content type should be something like application/JSON. Then we can have the body of the request. This needs to have a comma. The body will be, of course, a JSON string. So we're going to convert this data to a JSON string, data to send. So that's the body of our request if you are to do a post method. Then we would do outside here. Now we would come and do then again response. Then this response can be, oh, there's a problem here. This needs to be then. Then this response, we can console log the data or do something with the data, or we can return something. At the bottom, we can do a then again. Then in this then, we pass in the data and do something with the data here. We now also do a catch to end this. Then we pass in the error. So what's important, this part we've covered it extensively in the other tutorials, so we don't want to pay attention to that. We want to pay attention to this particular point of how to handle different HTTP request methods. So you would extend this function, this fetch function, to accommodate those other variables or those other headers, body, and the method in that particular request. So I don't want to test that for the sake of just saving time. So the next part is the last part, which is to add async await, or to reformat this function into async await. So I have added a try here. Then I simply removed the then and changed this function to have a different approach. So what we are simply doing to change, we do this, we call this an asynchronous function, which returns a promise. Then we handle the errors. Then we add the keyword await to fetch fetch the data. Then we add it as we pass this JSON data. Then we log the data here. So we can say, can log with a message, and we see we have logged the async data. So I have done a better tutorial in this series of async await, so I'm not also going to dwell too much on how to use async await, because this tutorial was simply about Fetch API. So the take home from this tutorial is you need to understand how to create a basic Fetch API request, then how to handle errors, then making different HTTP requests, then handling the headers, cross-origin errors, and async await. Async await, there is another tutorial I did in this series that you can check, and it has a very good example of how to get that done. I hope you found this useful, and if you did, kindly consider giving it a thumbs up, and do not forget to subscribe. Thank you. I hope by now you can now use Fetch API in your JavaScript. If you found this useful, kindly consider giving this video a thumbs up, and do not forget to subscribe. Thank you.